Shalom, Rabbi Shore. How are you?
I'm very good.
Welcome to my podcast, Cup of Joe. I'm happy to have you here. You are the founder of the Clarion Project, as I understand, which is an organization that exposes radical Islam threats to the West. Open Door Media, which produces documentaries aiming to engage and inspire Jewish identity. And most recently, I understand that you produced a documentary called Tragic Awakening based on a book called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Jew? Tell us a little bit about that project.
Okay. Well, this is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on your show. And you got it almost all right. Clarion Project started off as doing the documentaries about the threats of radical Islam. Now it's morphed into general extremism and threats to Americans in any way, and it's basically an intelligence organization. But we made about 7 or 8 major films that were seen by hundreds of millions of people to expose the threat of radicalism, and that got my filmmaking career going. And then I started Open Door Media, and we make feature films as well as a lot of short films. We do podcasts, and it's under Unpacked brand in social media. It's probably the #1 Jewish educational media organization in terms of the number of people watching the stuff. So it's great. And then this recent project, which is most exciting for me, it's an independent project. And it's the book that I've been working on for 3 years, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Jew? And subtitle, Learning to Love the Lessons of Jew Hatred. So it's an interesting take. And then we decided to make a film. Since I'm a filmmaker, we figured let's make a film on the same topic, and that's called Tragic Awakening. And we just released it a month ago. It premiered at the Miami Jewish Film Festival. We've done about 20 events with it until now, and it's going great. And
when you mentioned radical Islam, exposing the threats of radical Islam, is there such a thing as radical Islam and normal Islam or regular Islam? I get the idea that it's, we're trying to use terminology from Western religions and to place them on a different kind of religion. Am I wrong about that?
You're going right into the controversial subject, so that's okay. It's interesting. The answer is I learned from my rabbi on the subject, which I say jokingly, but Bernard Lewis, who was the #1 Arabic scholar for the last 50 years or so. He wrote 90 books on this subject. I had the pleasure of knowing him and interviewing him for several of my films. And he said, yeah, there is such a thing as radical Islam, meaning Islam has within it a lot of contradictions. This is how he explained it to me. So if someone chooses to lean in on the peaceful side of Islam, they can successfully find it. If someone leans into the extremist, radical, jihadi side of Islam, where you're supposed to kill all the infidels, you will also find that legitimately. So therefore, to say that it is a religion of peace would be also incorrect, because it is also a religion of war and domination and peace through subjugation of everybody else to become Islamic. But you can also find the opposite ideas. So there's a major discussion within Islam, of course, and fights in Sunni, Shiite, and within it many different types. But the bottom line is that it is not a seamless and clear ideology.
So if I'm a Muslim, let's say living in Gaza or in Jenin, and I want to connect more to the peaceful aspects of Islam and ignore the violent parts of it, will I be considered a devout Muslim? Will I be considered an observant Muslim? Or will I be considered kind of like a Muslim light, a kind of a Muslim that is not sure where he stands? How will I be considered by the Muslim world, the dominant Muslim world today?
Well, again, you can't. First of all, I'm not an Islamic scholar. So, secondly, you cannot paint a brush like that to say the dominant Islamic view today because it depends very much on societies and countries that are all variations. So if you were in Gaza and you took the position of wanting to be a peace-loving Gazan and wanting to have peace with Israel and brotherhood of men and lean in on that side of Islam, you'd probably be in trouble. You would be looked at as someone who's perhaps undermining the mainstream view, which is extremist today in Gaza and Judea and Samaria. And the Palestinians are rated from the ADL, no, the Pew Studies, I think, did it, the most anti-Semitic population in the world, with a rating of about 92 or 93% anti-Semitic. So you would be considered off the beaten track. However, if you were in a moderate Muslim country, and there are a few of them, and you adopted those attitudes, then you'd be fine. So Islam comes in waves also through history, because at some time, basically you see when they are not the dominant country, then they can become more peaceful as they settle into a role working with others. If they're gaining power or if they're in power, they tend to lean more towards the extremist sides.
Mm-hmm. So do you discuss that at all in the documentary? Tell us a little bit about the documentary and how, whether it relates to what's going on today and the war that we're involved in.
Yeah, I don't get into Islam so much in this video and in the film and book. I should qualify that. What we just discussed, I don't get into, but the subject of radical Islamist anti-Semitism is very much at the core of this book. What I'm exploring is what is the reason? What is the deep underlying reason for anti-Semitism? Why is it for 3,000 years that the Jewish people have been hated and persecuted? Why is it so intense? Why has it lasted so long? Why is every possible explanation in history for hatred and bigotry has been used against the Jews? In every society, it's something else, and very often the opposite. What is the underlying cause of it all? And why is it even persisting today? What is going on? And this is, since October 7th, this is very much a topic on the minds of most Jews, Israelis, and Jews of diaspora, because it was shocking to so many people. What, it's still alive? I thought it was over. I thought the Holocaust, we're now living in a modern world, and yet to see not only what Hamas did, but to see the global reaction of support against Israel, you could say it, whether it's support for Hamas, but it's certainly support against Israel, has been shocking for Jews everywhere. And I come to answer that. And I answered in a very surprising way, which does go into both the roots of Nazi ideology as well as radical Islamist ideology.
And what's the conclusion?
The conclusion that we actually come through first from the ideology of Adolf Hitler, but then we see the most amazing thing, which is Hitler's answer for why he hated the Jews matches the Torah's answer for why there's anti-Semitism. So it's very surprising. And the answer is, first, according to Adolf Hitler, Hitler had a very clear ideology. That already is surprising because most people have been raised to understand that Hitler was a lunatic, a raving lunatic with no clear ideas, just he was a great speaker, so he was able to rally everybody and brainwash a country. Great speaker, yes, but he was very ideological. And his ideology was written and spoken about constantly. So it's really quite amazing that I'm the one who's revealing this in the book. I'm not the only one. There are historians who've talked about it, but the conventional wisdom does not understand it. And in Hitler's view, the world had essentially two major opposing outlooks. One, Weltanschauung worldview, had the idea of humanitarianism, of love your neighbor, of peace on earth, equal rights, and human rights. On the other side was that, which came from social Darwinism, was the idea of might makes right and domination, and don't help the weak and poor because that doesn't help the survival of the fittest. So these two worldviews are in conflict. And Adolf Hitler believed deeply, and he wasn't unique. This was a tradition in German thought from the middle of the 1800s, since Darwin and social Darwinism came into the fore. The idea was that human development depends upon conflict, domination, struggle, and survival of the fittest in the same way that the animal kingdom does. In the animal kingdom, it's all about survival of the fittest, and the result is that the weak elements die off, the strong elements survive, and as a result, there's a development of the animal world to get stronger and stronger. When you go to a zoo, you see the opposite effect. You see domestication and then supporting the weak, supporting the sick, and as a result, they're not very vital. They're lethargic, and it's sad. So Hitler believed if you take the same principles and apply it to man, as social Darwinism did, then the ideas of humanitarianism will cause the destruction of humanity, because you will enable the weak to survive, both nations and individuals within nations. And so Hitler looked at the world. I'm giving you a very short version of this. Hitler looked at the world around him in the 20th century, and he said, we are in big trouble. The world is in big trouble because this other ideology of love and peace and humanitarianism, which they called the human concept, it was dominating as a result of Judaism, Christianity, and then even Bolshevism, communism, which was based on the idea of equality and in theory of brotherhood of all mankind. He said that's winning. That ideology has won over the hearts and minds of the world, of Western civilization. And he said that's going to be the end of civilization. So he said, I have to turn this around for the sake of humanity, not just for the sake of the German people, but for the sake of Europe. And so he said, I have to solve this problem. And in order to solve it, the first thing I need to do is get rid of the people who invented these ideas. And not only the ones who invented it, but who have it inherently in them. Hitler believed that Jews had this ideology inside of them, in their racial, spiritual DNA. And therefore, it didn't matter if they're religious or not, or if they're educated or not, Jews are going to represent these ideologies and bring it to the world. And so he said, I have to do genocide to get rid of it. He was also going to get rid of Christianity, and he was also getting rid of Bolshevism, communism. That was the worldview. And I exposed that in this book and in the film. And so it's fascinating, it's new, it's interesting. And then I go a step further, but I'm going to pause for breath because that was a long-winded statement.
Well, a few questions come to mind. The first is Hitler's ideology was also based on the Aryan race and racism. Within the Aryan race, there were also people that, especially in the wake of the Weimar Republic, and there was the church, there was a Lutheran church, there were clergymen who believed in these concepts. You know, one could argue this is a concept that crosses all races. How did racism and, let's say, the Semitic race, the Jewish race, and versus the Aryan race, how does that fit in with all this philosophy?
No, these are very good questions, and the answer is simple. In lieu of species, in the animal kingdom, it is a competition between species. In the human kingdom, it is a competition of nations, of people, of races. So that's where racism fits in. In other words, it is a competition between who is going to be the most powerful, strong nation. Who are the lions in the jungle? And who are the ones that need to be crushed? And who are the ones that need to be subservient? That is a competition between peoples/nations/races. In Hitler's view, the Aryan nation, the Germanic nation, were the lions of the kingdom. And therefore, they had the right to be on top and subjugate. But the right to be on top is if you succeed on being on top and subjugate the other ones. That's A. B, you can see the fulfillment of this ideology because they had their own euthanasia campaign within their own people. They were consistent on this ideology. So I think it was in 1940, it's in my book, The Accurate Information, They killed 70,000 of their own Germans because they were weak or mentally disabled. They were on a euthanasia campaign to wipe them out because that doesn't help the species survive. There was a public outcry, and that comes to your third point, that there was a lot of people in Nazi Germany. They might have supported the Nazis because they were anti-Semitic or because they wanted German pride back. They might not have understood the depth of Nazi ideology, and that applied also to much of the church. And many Christians followed and supported the Nazis. But if they did, they were really stupid because Hitler said Germany, Nazism, and religion could never exist together. He was hell-bent on destroying Christianity, and he says it over and over and over again in his private discussions. But he felt he's in a Christian nation, so it's not the first strategy. It's not the first campaign to start on, A. And B, he said that Christianity was on its way out anyways. It was weak, it was lethargic, and it was going to disappear, so you don't need to take it on. It weren't as big a threat. Bottom line, the Jews were the most serious threat. Christianity needed to be destroyed, but they were not as serious a threat.
And what brought Hitler to seek an alliance with the Mufti of Jerusalem? Or how does Islam and the Muslim world, the Arab world, fit in with this ideology? I mean, if one looks at it objectively, you would say that he would despise the Arabs are Semitic. They come from the same, from the same racial lineage that the Jews come from. What is he? Why is he going to meet with the Mufti of Jerusalem?
Yeah, you're touching on a very interesting point in history, and it's fascinating, and I go into it in both the film and the book, that in 1941, the Mufti of Jerusalem came to Berlin to meet Adolf Hitler, and he was treated as a special guest of state. And they got along so famously that the Mufti stayed in Berlin through the years till 1944, and he became a very active supporter of Nazism, and he even built up a Muslim SS division. And it's remarkable because you're right. On the one hand, if he's against religion, why isn't he against Islam? And if he's against Jews who are Semites, why isn't he against them? And the answer is Hitler viewed Christianity as a threat because it was Judeo-Christian values. They were serious about God. They were serious about humanitarian ethics and peace on earth and love and brotherhood. Hitler didn't think Islam was like that. Hitler believed that Islam was a dominating, cruel, violent ideology, so it was a perfect ally with his views of the world. So it was quite amazing. I don't think they were his best friends in terms of the race, but he was happy to work with them as opposed to considering them a deep enemy. But what's most amazing about this topic is that Islam, the world of radical Islam, were the only ally of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis that survived World War II and did not have to repent or were not destroyed. All the other allies were destroyed, they lost, and they had to change their ways. Radical Islam was an ally that continued. The baton was passed from Nazism and Adolf Hitler to the Mufti of Jerusalem and the world of radical Islam in that epoch. And for 100 years, we have been experiencing the ongoing results of that battle, that the radical Islamic world is still hell-bent on completing the job that Adolf Hitler began, to do genocide and to wipe out the Jewish people, and the focus is on the state of Israel.
When you using this term radical Islam, we also have on the playing field now the Palestinian Authority, or the successors to Yasser Arafat and the PLO, who don't hold themselves out as a religious organization at all. They're a secular, they hold themselves out as a secular organization, and yet we see the same kind of anti-Semitism, the same kind of desire to murder us, How is that explained?
Well, I think as time's gone on, they've become more radical Islamic by nature. Although they were started, Arafat was founded by communist Russia. He was an agent of the KGB originally, and they trained him and got the PLO started. But as time's gone on, they've become more radicalized, more religious, more Islamic in their demeanor and in their rhetoric. And the answer to that is that you don't need to be a Nazi or a radical Islamic. You don't need to adhere to either of those ideologies to be anti-Semitic and to want to see the destruction of the Jewish people. As I said, this has been going on for 3,000 years, this fight against the Jews, especially the last 2,000 years. And every type of explanation is used. So the question is, what's underlying it? And that's what we get to, that Adolf Hitler had a very clear ideology that there is a conflict. Are you trying to bring light, spirituality, humanitarianism, and humanity into the world, or are you going in the other direction? In other words, just like a human being, every human being has a body-soul conflict. Are we going to lean into our body and become more animalistic and go and give into our urges and behave like more animalistic? Or are we going to try to overcome those physical urges and become more spiritual and lead by our soul? It's a constant conflict. Just like that's a conflict in the life of every single human being, that is the conflict of human history for humanity. Which way is humanity going to go? The Jewish people at Mount Sinai were given a mission by God to bring humanity into the world, to bring the soul into the world. It says in the Gemara, in Avodah Zorah, it says, at Sinai, Sin'ah came into the world. As soon as the Jewish people were given this mission, hatred, Jew hatred came into the world because the body is going to resist. And so for 3,500 years, the Jewish people have been carrying out this mission of bringing humanitarian values, godly values, the soul into the world. And for 3,500 years, people have been resisting it and fighting against the Jewish people and our mission. And it's a push and pull. It's a push and pull. As humanity has slowly become more spiritual and more engaged in the Judeo-Christian, one could say, ethics, we've advanced. But then sometimes we go take a step backwards or someone else comes to fight it. Adolf Hitler was uniquely clear. For some reason, he had the clarity of what was the nature of this battle and that the Jews, it was the battle of Jews against Germany. And he said everything else is facade and illusion. He said on the surface, we're fighting England, we're fighting Russia, but underneath it, there's only one real battle going on, Jews and Germans over this ideology.
And how does that explain Christian anti-Semitism?
So Christian anti-Semitism, and again, I touch upon this in the book, the idea is the same thing, that to the extent that Christians are not actually living 100% with the values that they are adopting, that there's a push and pull even within Christianity. So yeah, they can be mouthing the idea of love your neighbor and love humanity, but then they're going on crusades and killing people, right? And trying to be dominating and trying to win over converts by force. So they are not necessarily living with these ideologies, with these ideas. So in history, we've gone through times where they've become more Christian in their beliefs and less Christian in belief. Sigmund Freud actually calls it that the Christian anti-Semitism was because they were badly christened, but their basically impulses are still fighting. Their human body, physical impulses are still fighting it. They didn't want it fully, just like Esav in the Torah wasn't willing to take upon himself the yoke of being moral, and he gave it up. Christians are from that lineage, and it's the same experience that we've seen throughout history, that they want it, they idealize it, but living with it sometimes is a little bit more difficult with all the discipline required.
So the whole idea about the fact that the Jews killed Jesus, and that was, that was what was their, was that just a reason that was offered for the anti-Semitism? Is that just masking the real
reasons versus excuses? I call it. Is it a reason or excuse? I think it was Franz Rosenzweig, a 19th century Jewish philosopher, who said, they don't hate us because we killed God, they hate us because we gave them God. And this is the deep reason of what's going on. And again, in every generation, it's because we killed God, it's because we're communists, it's because we're capitalists, it's because we're rich, it's because we're poor, it's because we're inferior race, it's because we took the land of the Palestinians, it's because we're oppressors, it's because we're committing genocide. Every reason and its opposite is used to explain anti-Semitism, which should be our first clue to not accept those first reasons, because those are the superficial excuses. But there's something underneath that's driving it all. As Douglas Murray said, it can't be a coincidence, meaning the fact that in every generation, it's the Jews that are chosen by the tyrants and by the evil of the generation. The fact that it always goes after the Jews and comes up with a different excuse, it's not a coincidence. There's something about the Jews that is deeply bothering the Gentile. And it doesn't have to be. There's a lot of philo-Semites. There's a lot of people who love the Jewish people. Those are the ones who are good. But the ones who are fighting this message and the Ten Commandments, those are the ones who are going to come against the Jewish people. And they might not be clear why. They might not understand what's going on deep in their psychology in their heads. Adolf Hitler had it clear. But other ones just feel it, and then they're going to come up with an excuse that makes sense.
So is it safe to say that anti-Semitism really is a war against God, against the presence of God in the world?
That's what the Torah says. That's the Torah explanation for anti-Semitism.
Where is that?
It's in several places, but the most obvious one is in the Parshas Matos, where Hashem says to Moshe, take revenge upon the people of Midian, do it for the sake of the Jewish people. Nikom nikmas b'nei Yisrael. Mm-hmm. That was what Hashem, take revenge, do a war against Midian for the sake of the Jewish people. Moshe turns around to the Jewish people and says, God just told me, Nikom nikmas Hashem, take revenge for the sake of Hashem on the Midianites. So why did he change the language? So Rashi says right on the spot, if you're fighting the Jewish people, you're fighting God. But then, that's one source. It's also, the Ramban brings it. It's also, and what I just told you in the Gemara, at Sinai, Sinah came into this world. So there's a lot of very clear sources in the Torah that describe this, and ultimately it is that war against ethics and humanitarianism and love and peace and the demands of becoming a higher human being. So it's a fight against God, yes.
So how do you explain the fact that if we brought the Ten Commandments into the world, in the sense we brought morality and ethics into the world, how are we being judged now by, let's say, the Hague court, international court, on principles of international of ethics of war? How is it possible that we who brought ethics and morality into the world are being judged by the enemies of that ethics and morality on the basis of of ethics and morality?
Whatever works. Today's whatever a society holds to be the most supreme values, the Jews are going to be the opposite. So if you're in a religious society like Christianity, we killed God. That's the most, what could be worse? If science is the religion of the day, we're the lowest race. If human rights is the religion of the day, as it is today, then the Jews are the biggest violators. But I say that it's clear, the double standard is clear that it's anti-Semitism, because that's the answer to your question. It's anti-Semitism. The double standards reveal the anti-Semitism. And I say like this, people are out there saying that Jews are committing genocide. Right, that's the call on the college campuses and by the leaders and the politicians in The Hague, and we are executing the worst war, the most inhumane war in human history. There's two choices about that. Since we know that it's not true, since if 20,000 Gazans, apart from the militants, have been killed in 12 months, right? We know that that's not genocide. Right? We know that's not genocide, right? So how can you say it? Is it either you're stupid or you're anti-Semitic? Ignorant or anti-Semitic. There's only two choices, and these are college professors. So they know what the definition of genocide is. They know that 20,000 Jews were killed in Auschwitz every single day, and that was just Auschwitz. There was only one concentration camp. That's what genocide is. To say 20,000 Palestinians over the course of a year and the whole world is freaking out about it, that's a double standard that reveals underneath it is anti-Semitism. They would never agree. No one's anti-Semitic. In the film, we have a guy saying, I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm just for human rights. I'm against genocide. They really believe it. But we have to go deeper and say, well, I don't see you protesting about the Ukrainians. I don't think anybody knows how many Ukrainian civilians have been killed, how many Somalians have been killed in the last year by radical Islamists. Nobody knows those numbers and nobody cares. But if you go to any college campus, you're going to see how many, you're going to see on the floor of the quad, the marking saying how many Palestinians. Is it because they love the Palestinians so much? No, it's because the only difference is that Jews are involved.
So that brings me...
I'll add one more thing. And how do we know they don't care about the Palestinians? Because the entire world is actually breaking an international human rights law by not letting the Palestinians out of Gaza. In Iraq, when there's a war, in Syria, when there's a war, both times and every time, the world lets out civilians by the millions and lets them out and takes care of them as refugees until the war is over to get them out of harm's way. Only in the Gazan war does all of a sudden humanity come up with a new concept. We can't displace people. Well, you did it every other time, but here the international community does not let one Gazan, one Palestinian get out. Why? Why all of a sudden have they created a new value system, and they create a value out of it? Can't displace people. Let them out, and let them be free from the danger of the war. But no, and then they can easily say, look what the Jews are doing. They're killing so many civilians. So the double standards are just rife. They're all over the place, and it reveals the fundamental Jew hatred and anti-Semitic bias in large parts of the human community today.
And how does that explain the pact that we're seeing now over the past year between progressivism, wokeism, and support for the Gazans, and support for the struggle against Israel, and even support for the atrocities that were committed by the Arabs on October 7th? How does that? Ostensibly, you're seeing a pact between those who would believe in universalism and human rights, in the right of people to live the lives the way they want to live, against oppression, who are now making this alliance with the biggest oppressors and the oppressors of their lifestyle. Where does that come in?
Right. You're pointing out the incredibly fascinating irrationality of this, what they call the red-green alliance, and the fact that you can have LGBTQ queers marching for Hamas, even though if they would spend one day in Gaza, they'd probably be killed, fighting against the one liberal democracy in the Middle East, is just something completely too weird to fathom. And again, nobody brings it up. But the answer is that they're both fighting the Jews. And again, that brings in a lot of things, like we just talked about Midian and Moab. They hated each other. But for the Jews, they get together. So when it comes to fighting the Jewish people, we create a lot of allies. And that's like Islam, and the Nazis shouldn't have been a natural ally either, but they were in World War II. And over here, again, it comes down to the same fault line of human history. Are they trying to bring in these ethics of Sinai into the world, or are they fighting against them? And one could very easily argue that the very far left progressive world in America and on campuses, they're anti-American. they're anti-Jewish, they're anti-American, and so they're allying on this side of history against Judeo-Christian values. So it ends up being the same fault line.
So it's not just that the enemy that the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend, or am I saying it correctly? If we have a joint enemy, then we become allies. It's also that is it safe to say that both Islam and wokeism, progressivism are fighting against civilization, against the Ten Commandments?
Yes, that is fair to say. The LGBT community has wanted to change the definition of morality. They've been quite successful in America. It's been a very aggressive political, cultural campaign for the last 30, 40 years to change the Judeo-Christian values on sexual morality. And so there are these culture wars going on, and they're standing on one side of history. I just want to segue, because we still haven't gotten to my main point. The reason I wrote the book and the reason I made the film is not simply to expose the nature of anti-Semitism. It's not, even though it's very fascinating and it's worthy of itself for having a book, but it's not my main purpose. My main purpose is to be able to flip it on its head and say, actually, Hitler was right in the sense that he put his fingers on the Jewish people as being the main conveyors of this humanitarian ethics of spirituality of God into the world. We were the main spiritual superpower of humanity for 3,000 plus years. He was correct about that. We need to start looking at the world in a different way, because if we understand the nature of anti-Semitism, then we can flip it on its head and say, you know what? It's amazing to be a member of this awesome Jewish people. And I think that today that is so critical, because in the words of Dr. Robert Wistrich, who was one of the great scholars of anti-Semitism at Hebrew University, he said Jews today need an inner armor, and he was saying this 20 years ago. We need to develop inner armor, or as Ruth Weiss calls it, moral self-confidence. Because in the face of a world that's condemning the Jewish people, if you're a young kid on campus and they're hating on Israel, and the United Nations hating on Israel, and all your professors are hating on Israel, and they're all saying you're part of it because you're Jewish, how do you withstand that psychological pressure? And this is the psychological pressure Jews have been facing for 2,000 years. How do we withstand it and stay strong? And the answer is, if you know who you are, if you understand what being Jewish is about, and if you understand what anti-Semitism is about, then you can have the inner armor, and you can look at the world, and you can look at these double standards, and you can say, wow, they've got a problem. No, I don't have a problem. I, in fact, gain strength from the fact that evil identifies me as good, and the ones who are bringing good into the world and light into the world. That gives me strength and pride. So I believe that we, as the Jewish community, need to open up this conversation and go much deeper into what is the hatred about and what are the Jewish people about.
So I know that you have a background also in Kiruv. You've done work for Aish HaTorah, Discover Project. How does this message, how is this message presented to the Jew, to the unaffiliated Jew, to the uneducated Jew who's looking to come closer to Judaism and to the Torah?
Yeah, well, my background is, I mentioned before the show, I'm originally from Canada and London, Ontario, and I didn't grow up religious, but I grew up a proud Jew, Zionist background. I went to camps, Jewish camps, and it was great. It was a great upbringing, great family, and strong Jewish identity, but not religious at all. But when I was 20, my twin brother ended up coming to Aish HaTorah. He was 18, and I came at age 20 to show him that he was nuts, because the Judaism that we were told about in our conservative Hebrew school was enough to convince me that Judaism is silly, irrelevant, and stupid. And so when my brother grabbed onto it at age 18, I figured he must have lost a couple screws, and I came at 20 to try to convince him that he was making a terrible mistake in life. And of course, then as an adult, I was now presented Judaism from people who know Torah and know Judaism, and from people who had strong intellectual backgrounds. And so even despite me and all my preparation at University of Toronto to prepare and understand the other side of the arguments, I was blown away that Judaism had such a richness intellectually and spiritually. And that was a wake-up for me. And I decided after university that I was going to come study in yeshiva, and that this was so meaningful to me that I had understood the beauty of the Jewish people, the beauty of Judaism, the beauty of living in Israel. So I decided to make my life in Israel, and that I would dedicate my life to trying to bring that beauty, share it with other Jews who were like me, not given the gift of, they were given the gift of being Jewish, but without the knowledge of what it was all about. So I spent 25 years working for Aish Torah. I was the COO of Aish International for 10 plus years. And about 16 years ago, I went on my own to pursue this film career with these two organizations, Clarion and Open Door Media, because I believe that we can use film and media to educate huge numbers of Jews. And so these two products, the book, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Jew, and the film Tragic Awakening, are independent projects that have the potential, I believe, to educate a lot of people and give them a deeper understanding of what it is to be Jewish.
Because I want to now get focus on where does the state of Israel go with all this? Is the state of Israel acting appropriately in its relationships with the rest of the world, even with its allies, in the way it fights its wars, in the inner conflict of what's going on here? Because we're seeing, and the war that started a year ago began with this horrible inner conflict between us. What is the documentary and the book? How does that shed light, and how can that help us move past this conflict and defeat our enemies, and also make peace with each other here in Israel? How does this project of the state of Israel and Zionism move forward? And does your documentary have something to teach us about that?
Well, it definitely has something to teach us on it. I'm not prescribing what the state's policies in executing the war should be.
Why not? I mean, doesn't
the extrapolations come? For example, I did a screening of the film 2 weeks ago in Colorado Springs, Colorado, to a group of non-Jews, and I asked them rhetorically. I said, if October 7th happened in California or New Mexico, and the equivalent proportionally of Americans were killed and raped, towards 30,000 it would be, and thousands were taken hostage, and missiles were raining down on California on an ongoing basis. I said, how long would it take America to solve that problem? How many days would there be missiles raining down on California? And I said, we all know it would be, maybe a week, and there wouldn't be much left of Mexico. And after somebody came up to me and he said, I actually know the answer to, you asked it rhetorically, Rabbi, but I actually know the answer to that question because I work for the American Missile Defense System. Colorado Springs has a lot of military. So he said it would take us 3 to 4 days. And not only that the reason it would take 3 to 4 days is because we have a principle called proportionality, which means if there's a problem, we take care of it. That's their definition of proportionality. Yeah. So if there's missiles raining down, then we do whatever force is necessary to stop the missiles flying against us. Again, this is an example of the double standard, that for the Jews, there's a different definition of proportionality, which is, you can't hurt them more than they hurt you. They killed 1,200, you killed 1,200. Why are you smashing Gaza? In the meantime, there's been 26,000 missiles shot against the Jewish state over the last year. Why? So the answer is that we are not behaving, in my estimation, the way we should be, because we are afraid of the non-Jewish world's reaction. Now, we're afraid for good reason. For America says, if you behave that way, we might not send you any more missiles that you need. We won't give you the weapons. So there's sometimes practical reasons behind it. But that also, the fact that America and the West and the United Nations and the European Parliament are all condemning us for doing much less than they all would do in the same circumstance is an anti-Semitic double standard. And we as Jews, if we had moral self-confidence and we could look at this clearly, we would just do what needs to be done. They told Bibi, don't go into Rafah. Thank God he didn't listen. They threatened, do not go in. Thank God he did not listen. But we need to have the kahunas to do that more and more effectively, to do what is required to defend ourselves as a proud Jewish people. And we are still, the bottom line of what I'm saying is that the Jewish people are still in a galut mentality. We still have, even though we're Israeli and we're strong and we're fighting Jews now, but we still, to a large degree, are hanging on to an exile mentality, and we might not be happy to admit it. We need to shed that and become stronger. And I think the trend is that we are, especially the younger generation. So I think we're going in a good direction, the young Jews, especially in Israel. American Jews, that's another story.
So when the title of the book, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Jew, does that have anything to say about Jewish, in other words, it seems like the nations of the world are very happy to have, they don't want, let's say, Israel to be destroyed. They want Israel to exist, but to be in kind of the semi-weakened state where it needs the protection of the rest of the world. And does that title the Big Bad Jew, meaning that they're actually afraid of Jews becoming too powerful, or of the state of Israel becoming too powerful? Is the title, reflecting that at all?
Yeah, the title has deep meaning. The idea stems initially from, and the cover of the book, I forgot to bring one, but the cover of the book shows Adolf Hitler looking up at the strong Jew, and a radical Islamist looking up in fear of the strong Jew, and a college student looking up at the strong Jew. And the idea is that Hitler's anti-Semitism was not so much hatred of the Jews, it was fear of the Jews, as I was describing earlier. He was afraid of a Jewish spiritual victory for the world, and that would destroy humanity in his estimation. This is what he was about. So he was afraid of the Jew. And so what's happened, unfortunately, is that the Jews themselves, we have become afraid of the big bad Jew. We have to become very strong, morally self-confident people. And we have absorbed this, and it's reasonable that we've absorbed it. 2,000 years of persecution, of being told that we're a terrible people and that we're the cause of so many problems and everyone looking down on us. For 2,000 years, it makes sense that we're messed up psychologically, but we need to fix that inside of ourselves. That's the idea of it. We need to become more proud of who we are.
This is, I think, my last question, because it's a question that many people are asking today, and I think a question about that can give us some guidance on how to move forward. Many people point to the fact that Nazism was essentially defeated, except for small fringe groups here and there. But when we talk about, when the state of Israel framed its the goals of the war, it was to defeat Hamas. And then after a while, people started saying, you can't defeat Hamas because Hamas is an idea and you can't defeat an idea. And then the counter argument was, well, the free world defeated Nazism and we defeated communist Russia. Why can't we defeat Islam, radical Islam, the notions in Islam of trying to destroy us and throw us into the sea? Why can't that idea be defeated? Or maybe it can.
Well, I think that there is an element of truth that radical Islam is a deep ideology that's been around for about 1,500 years, and it might not be going away so fast. But that doesn't mean that you should not fight and destroy your enemy, just like the Americans destroyed the Islamic State successfully. That doesn't mean that Al-Qaeda is now gone forever from the books of history, but it means that you successfully destroyed a very serious threat to Western civilization. The same thing here. The idea that we can live side by side with a genocidal enemy, and we provide electricity and humanitarian aid, which is what we did for the better part of 20 years while they were preparing how they do genocide and educating the most anti-Semitic population in the 21st century. It was patently absurd, but we're afraid of the world's reaction. If the world was serious about helping the Arabs, helping the Palestinians, they would make sure that their educational system, which they pay for, would be fixed, and they would teach tolerance and love and acceptance of Jews and the other. But they don't. And this allows a thorn to be in the side of the Jewish people for all this time. And thank God, right now, we are not listening, and we are doing our best to destroy Hamas and to destroy Hezbollah. And we should, if we weren't afraid of the world, also do Iran. If we would successfully defeat Hamas, Hezbollah, and make a very significant attack on Iran, we might be doing humanity the greatest favor that could be done in the 21st century. Not just the world, but the Arabs. One of my friends, Raphael Shores, just wrote a piece in the National Post. It'll be the greatest gift. Free the Iranians from a radical Islamic regime that most of them do not want, and many of them, at least half, do not want it now, even after 40 years of brainwashing. And similarly, in Gaza, you think these are not free, happy people. Let's free the Arabs. Let's give Lebanon back to Lebanon. Free them from these radical Islamist dictatorships who are enslaving them and giving them a miserable life. The Jewish people have been given an opportunity to take a leadership position for the free world today in the face of the Western world abdicating and America abdicating. I hope that we continue to act with strong moral principles and execute this war against our enemies, who are the Western world's enemies completely, accomplish our job, and God willing, the prophecies will be fulfilled, and the Islamic, the Abraham Accords could expand beyond, and we could end up in a very wonderful world coming out of this. But unfortunately, evil first needs to be destroyed.
So when you frame it as Israel being afraid of what the Western world will say, is it possible to say that we're also afraid of ourselves?
Yes,
we're afraid of our own mission, of our destiny, of our identity, and that's also holding us back?
Yes, 100%. Yeah, and I mentioned that in the book, that the who's afraid of the big bad Jew is not just about the anti-Semites being afraid of us, but it's also that the Jewish people have become somewhat afraid of our own mission, and it's held us back. Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin, in their book, Why the Jews, which I think next to mine is the best book on the topic, they say that there's been a fundamental de-Judaization of anti-Semitism. In other words, the Jewish people have contributed to the de-Judaization of anti-Semitism. Basically, we say scapegoat theory. It has nothing to do with the Jews. It's just we were at the wrong place at the wrong time in history. If someone else was there, they would have gotten hit. We basically have explained anti-Semitism as a Jewish community for the last 50 years, all the way from World War II and Hitler, as something that, they just became crazy and they needed a scapegoat, right? But what we're seeing and what I'm sharing in this book and in my film is that no, they hate us because we're Jewish. They hate us because we represent something. And that if we understand it and flip it on its head, we can be tremendously proud. We can own it, love it, and be empowered by it and carry out our mission in the world. And God willing, we will do that. So
the book is available now. You can order the book on your website.
And on Amazon.
and on Amazon. And the documentary is not out. The trailer I know is out. The trailer is fascinating. But when will the documentary be out?
The documentary is out. It's available at tragicawakening.com, or they can go to my website, raphaelshore.com with a PH, and find out when it's going to be available. But we are trying to create a lot of screenings. So if anybody's interested in doing a small screening in their community or a large screening in their community, their church, their synagogue, be in touch with us through the website, and we will help you arrange a screening to get the conversation going, to allow this discussion to happen in your family, with your friends, in your community. So we're going to hopefully be doing hundreds of screenings, if not thousands, in the coming months, with people's help, film festivals, conferences, and then starting sometime next year, we will make it broadly available for free. But in the meantime, be in touch with us at tragicawakening.com.
Okay, great. Rabbi Shore, I wish you tremendous success. I think your message is a very important message for the Jewish people to understand at this point, and should have continued success and an impact on the Jewish community.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here today. Thank you.